This is a separate segment on how to calculate the more difficult percentiles. It's nice and easy when the test makers are nice to you and they tell you a z-score of 0, 1, 2. But what do you do when it's in between the gaps? Don't panic. It's not that hard. It's still very logical, and you follow the same procedure. You figure out your z-score, you figure out where on the map you are, and you're still going to move from 50% towards your data point, adding to the right, subtracting to the left. The trick is you got to figure out which gap you're in. The whole number in your z number tells you how many standard deviation lines you have crossed. So if your z-score is 1.2, that means that you have crossed one line and you're 0.2 of the way into the next one. So that means you're in this gap here. You've done this gap, that's what the 1 tells you. If your z-score is negative 0.1, it's the same thing, but you're moving to the left. So it tells you you've crossed one line and you're 0.2 of the way into the next gap. So you're done with the 34 gap and you're in the 14 gap. So here's what you do. You take your decimal, not the whole number. You've already done the whole number to figure out which gap you're in. You take the decimal times the number of percentiles in that gap you're in, and then you save that, and then you do your whole procedure again. 50 minus 34, because there's always 34 in that gap, minus what you just calculated, 0.2 of the way into 14. 0.2 times 14 is 2.8. So you would go 50 minus 34 minus 2.8, and that would give you your percentile. Same thing on the other side. If your z-score was positive 1.2, you are 1 and then 0.2 of the way in here. So you take 0.2 times 14, because you're in this gap, that's 2.8. 50 plus 34 plus 2.8, and that should be 86.8. Here's another somewhat easier example. Let's just go with a z-score of 0.5. It's 0.5, so how many lines of standard deviation have you crossed? 0. That means you're in this first gap. And how far into that gap are you? That's what the decimal tells you. You're 0.5 of the way. So you're right here. So you're in this gap of 34, and you're 0.5 of the way there. So you take 0.5 times 34, and then you do your thing. You start at 50, and you add, since you're moving to the right, your 0.5 times 34. That's 17. And so if your z-score is 0.5, you are 50 plus 17. 67 is your percentile. Think of it now for negative 0.5. If that's your z-score, you are 1/2 of a standard deviation below the mean. So you are 0 standard deviations and 0.5. You haven't crossed there. You're halfway here. You're right here. 0.5 times 34 is 17. So you take 50 minus that 17, and that should be 33. Think of it like miles. There are 34 miles from here to here, and you are halfway there, 0.5 of the way there. So you have 17 here and 17 left to go. Again, if your percentile is a little bit more obnoxious than that, you basically do the same thing. If your percentile is if your z-score is 2.2, the whole number tells you how many of these you've crossed. 1, 2. The decimal tells you how far into the gap you are. So you are 1, 2, and then 0.2 of the way into that one. That gap has 2 in it, so you take 0.2 times 2 for 0.4, and you start all over. 50 plus 34, because you got all of that, plus 14, because you got all that, plus, what do we say? 0.4. So 98.4. Same thing if it was negative 2.2. The negative 2, the whole number, tells you how many lines you've crossed. 1, 2, and the 0.2 tells you that you are 0.2 of the way into there. So you take the decimal times the percentile in the gap, and you start all over. 50 minus 34 minus 14 minus what you calculated. So this should enable you to do the third part on the right side of the in-class practice z-scores and percentiles. I'm going to ask the camera to follow me on to something that I wrote earlier that will help you to figure this out. So if you are in between standard deviations, which means you have a decimal z-score, the whole number tells you which gap you're in or how many lines of standard deviation you have crossed. If your z-score is 1.5, you cross one line of standard deviation, and then you're 0.5 of the way into that gap. If your z-score is 2.9, then you've crossed 1, 2, and then you're 0.9 of the way into that gap. So the whole number tells you how many lines you cross. The decimal tells you how far into the gap you are. Multiply your decimal times the percent in the gap, either 34, 14, or 2, depending on which gap the whole number put you in. Move your whole number, do the whole 50 plus 34 plus 14, and then you move your partial. So I'm 0.5 of the way in there, I multiply that, and then I do that. So you first identify which gap you're in, and then how far into the gap you are, do your multiplication, and then start all over, 50 plus or minus 34, and then you do your decimal calculation, and you keep going that far. And so going back to the graph over here, one final example. If I am 1.8, if my z-score is 1.8, then I know I am 1 and then 0.8 of the way in here. So I take 0.8 times 14 because I'm in this gap, and then I go 50 plus 34 plus whatever 0.8 times 14 is. So on this sheet, if you look at letter D, 3D, what is the percentile for a z-score of negative 1.5? That is going to be on this side. It's going to be right here. And so you know you're 0.5 of the way here. Negative 1.5 tells you 1 and then 0.5. So you take 0.5 times 14, and then you go 50 minus 34 minus 0.5 times 14. So hopefully this helps you with this sheet. Again, I'm going to post the answers to this on the website on Sunday, and you can check yourself. Don't forget I have study sessions coming up next week, and I can prepare you for the test. Thanks to my cinematographer and director for sticking around on a Friday afternoon and helping with this. Hope this has been helpful. Thank you.